Boar crouched by the fire's edge, cradling a swaddled infant while the wind howled outside the cave mouth, and wondered how anyone could keep a newborn from turning into ice. The answer lies not in modern blankets, but in a suite of time-tested strategies that Ice Age peoples honed over millennia. First, the very location of a dwelling mattered. Archaeologists have found that Upper Paleolithic groups favored deep, south-facing rock shelters where the stone walls absorbed solar heat during the day and radiated it slowly through the night. Inside, they built a low, semi-enclosed hearth made of stone and packed earth, often lined with animal hides. The fire itself provided a steady source of radiant warmth, but the real secret was insulation. Mothers would wrap their babies in multiple layers of fur, usually the pelts of reindeer, bison, or woolly mammoth, often sewn together with sinew threads. These layers were deliberately kept thick on the limbs and torso, while a small pouch of fur around the head protected the delicate skull from wind-driven chill. In addition to clothing, families used body heat. When the night was especially bitter, the infant was placed in a communal sleeping pit, a shallow trench lined with dried grasses and covered with a thick blanket of fresh animal skins. Several adults would huddle around, pressing their bodies together to create a shared warm microclimate. Ethnographic parallels from Arctic Inuit and Siberian Evenki show that this body heat nest can raise the ambient temperature inside the pit by up to 10 degrees Celsius, enough to keep a baby from hypothermia. Water management was another crucial factor. Scientists believe Ice Age peoples avoided soaking the baby's fur with melt water because damp fur loses its insulating air pockets and conducts cold directly to the skin. Instead, they kept the infant dry, using a dry skin or bark container to hold a small amount of warm water for feeding, then quickly drying the baby's skin afterward. When a mother needed to breastfeed, she would do so while seated close to the hearth, allowing the baby to benefit from the fire's convection currents. Evidence from preserved remains at the Dolny Vestana site shows that some mothers used a kind of infant carrier made from woven reeds and animal hide, allowing them to move around the cave while keeping the child's heat trapped against their own body. These carriers also freed the mother's hands for tasks like flint knapping or meat processing, ensuring the group's survival while the baby stayed snug. Finally, the community's knowledge of weather patterns helped them plan. By tracking seasonal wind directions and cloud cover, they could schedule the most vulnerable activities, like baby care and sleep, during calmer periods, often inside deeper chambers of the cave where the temperature stayed a few degrees above the outside plunge. So, while the wind outside might have been a brutal -40 degrees, a combination of strategic shelter placement, layered fur garments, communal body heat, dry keeping practices, and portable carriers gave Ice Age parents a realistic, science-backed way to keep their precious little ones warm and alive. How did Neanderthals keep their bodies from turning into blocks of ice when the wind sliced at -40 degrees? The answer isn't a high-tech insulated jacket. It's a clever combination of animal skins, layered bedding, and natural snow shelters that acted like a thermal blanket long before anyone thought of synthetic fibers. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of sites in the Altai, the Carpathians, and Western Europe, where the floor is lined with dozens of carefully arranged fur skins. Microscopic wear on the hide shows they were folded, overlapped, and tied with sinew, creating air pockets that trapped body heat. The fur side faced outward, while the leather side, still damp from the animal's blood, provided a moisture barrier that prevented the skin from freezing solid. Experiments with replica skins confirm that a 3-layer skin sandwich can keep a human's core temperature stable for up to 12 hours in sub-zero conditions. But the real secret weapon was the snow cave. When the first heavy snowfalls blanketed the landscape, Neanderthals would dig shallow depressions into the drift, then carve out a low ceiling and a small entrance tunnel. The snow's insulating properties are remarkable. A 30-centimeter wall of compacted snow reduces heat loss by about 80% compared to open air. Inside, the temperature hovers just a few degrees above freezing, even when it's -40 outside. Inside these caves, the Neanderthals spread their skin blankets over sleeping platforms made of pine branches, moss, and more fur. They would curl up, head tucked into a fur-lined hood, minimizing exposed surface area. The combination of the snow's static air and the reflective fur created a microclimate that stayed surprisingly dry. When the fire was out, a common occurrence because sparks were scarce, people would add a layer of ash to the ground. Ash acts like a thin, insulating carpet, absorbing residual heat from the bodies and preventing cold from radiating into the snow floor. Evidence from cut marks on reindeer ribs shows that they harvested hide in the coldest months, when the skin was thickest and fur most abundant. The same cuts appear on mammoth bones, suggesting they used the massive hides of these giants as communal blankets for whole families. In some sites, dozens of mammoth hides have been found stacked in a single dwelling, implying that the group rotated fresh layers to keep the interior warm and dry. Even the placement of the caves mattered. Researchers have mapped the orientation of entrances and found that most face away from prevailing winds, reducing the draft that would otherwise strip heat from the shelter. Some entrances were even built with a short, low-lying windbreak made of stacked stones, forcing incoming air to rise and lose heat before it reached the sleeping chamber. All of these strategies, layered animal skins, snow cave construction, careful orientation, and simple heat-trapping additives, show that Neanderthals weren't just brute hunters. They were skilled engineers of warmth, using everything nature gave them to create a hidden thermal blanket that let them thrive in an environment that would have killed any other hominin. How could anyone keep a fire burning when the ground itself was a solid block of ice? That's the question that keeps archaeologists up at night, and the answer is surprisingly simple. Ancient hunters weren't trying to build fireproof pits at all. They were digging beneath the permafrost to tap a hidden source of warmth. When the last glacial maximum swept across Europe and Siberia, the surface temperature often dipped below -40 degrees, and the top layer of soil froze solid for months on end. Yet deep under that frozen crust, the Earth retained a modest but steady heat flow from the planet's interior, a few degrees warmer than the air above. By excavating a shallow trench, sometimes a meter or two deep, Paleolithic peoples could reach this marginally thawed layer. The pit acted like a natural radiator. The heat from the ground kept the fire's embers alive far longer than a surface hearth ever could. Evidence for this practice comes from a string of sites in the Altai, the Carpathians, and even the upper reaches of the Danube Valley, where investigators have found charcoal concentrations and stone fire rings sitting in depressions cut into a layer of permafrost. Radiocarbon dates place these features squarely in the upper Pleistocene, and microscopic analysis of the surrounding sediment shows a distinct lack of freeze-thaw cracking, exactly what you'd expect if the pit stayed warm enough to avoid repeated thaw cycles. Why go to the trouble? A fire that dies out in a blizzard is more than an inconvenience. It's a loss of heat, light, protection from predators, and a way to process meat safely. By anchoring the flame in a warm pocket of earth, hunters could maintain a steady blaze through the night, dry their hides, and keep insects at bay. The pit also acted as a sort of thermal cache. Once the fire was out, the residual heat lingered in the surrounding soil for many hours, allowing the group to warm their hands or dry wet clothing without reigniting the flame. The technique wasn't just a clever hack. It reflects a deep, empirical understanding of their environment. Early humans observed that fires placed on exposed stone or in shallow depressions flickered out when the wind turned icy, while those set in low-lying hollows seemed to hold longer. Over generations, they refined the method, learning the optimal depth deep enough to reach the permafrost's warm seam, but shallow enough to dig quickly with stone tools. Some sites even show evidence of lining the pit with animal hides or moss, likely to insulate the fire further and prevent heat loss into the surrounding frozen ground. So when you see a fireproof pit in a museum exhibit, remember it's not a mythic invention of magical fire-resistant stone. It's a practical, low-tech solution born of trial, error, and a keen eye on the subtle warmth flowing from the planet's core. Ancient hunters weren't just surviving. They were mastering the microclimate beneath the ice, turning a frozen world into a series of tiny, reliable hearths that kept them alive through the harshest winters the Pleistocene could throw at them. How did our Ice Age ancestors deal with a frozen fingertip when the wind was howling at -40 degrees and there was no ambulance on speed dial? The answer isn't a high-tech frostbite clinic. It's a surprisingly practical mix of body heat, animal fat, and a dash of communal ingenuity that archaeologists have pieced together from cave paintings, wear patterns on bone, and ethnographic analogies with modern hunter-gatherer societies. First, early humans were masters of cold water therapy, but not in the spa-like sense you might picture. When a limb went numb and the skin turned white, the immediate goal was to restore circulation before the tissue died. The fastest way to do that was to get the frozen part back into the warmth of the body. Evidence from Upper Paleolithic sites shows that people would often wrap the injured extremity in the fur of a freshly killed animal, often a reindeer or bison, while simultaneously pressing it against their own chest or abdomen. The thick fur acted like an insulated blanket, and the body heat from the torso provided a gentle, steady warmth that could raise the temperature of the frostbitten tissue by a few degrees per hour, just enough to stop ice crystals from expanding further. If the frostbite was severe, they had an extra trick up their sleeves: animal fat. Charred bones from sites such as Dolny Vestonis contain residues of rendered fat, and experimental archaeology has demonstrated that applying warm animal fat directly to a chilled wound creates a protective, occlusive layer. The fat not only slows recooling, but also supplies a modest amount of heat as it cools, buying the injured limb precious time while blood flow returns. Some researchers think that early humans may have even used the heat from a small, portable fire, tiny ember pits that could be carried in a hollowed-out stone, to gently warm the fur-wrapped limb. The key was slow, controlled heat. A sudden blast of fire would scorch the already damaged skin and worsen the injury. Community played a crucial role, too. Ethnographic studies of the Inuit and other Arctic peoples reveal that when a member suffers frostbite, the whole group rallies. They share fur blankets, rotate the injured person into the warmest shelter, and even massage the affected area to stimulate blood flow. The same pattern shows up in the archaeological record. Clusters of hearths in cave sites suggest that people gathered around a central fire, not just for cooking, but also for medical care. The presence of multiple hearths in a single dwelling space indicates a communal effort to keep several people warm, which would have been vital when one individual needed extra attention. Finally, there's the psychological side. Surviving in an environment where the cold could turn you into a statue required a mindset of resilience. Early humans likely used rhythmic chants or storytelling while caring for a frostbitten limb, keeping morale high and the victim distracted from pain, an early form of what we'd now call pain management through attention diversion. So, while there were no antibiotics or sterile dressings, Ice Age peoples had a surprisingly sophisticated toolkit: body heat, animal fur, rendered fat, modest fire, and a tight-knit community. Together, these simple resources turned a potentially lethal frozen finger into a survivable setback, letting them keep hunting, gathering, and yes, telling the next generation how they beat the cold at its own game. How did early humans keep a saber-toothed cat from turning dinner into a nightmare when the world was a frozen wasteland? The answer isn't a high-tech laser trap, but a clever use of sound and terrain that ancient hunters turned into a deadly, acoustic trap. Picture a narrow, snow-packed gorge in a glacial valley, the walls steep and echo-filled, wind whistling through cracks like a distant howl. Archaeologists have uncovered a series of shallow pits, each lined with bone fragments, broken antlers, and cracked stone tools, arranged in a zigzag pattern at the bottom of such ravines. The pattern isn't random. It creates a resonant chamber that amplifies the slightest movement. When a saber-toothed cat stalks the gorge, its padded paws crush the loose snow and bone, producing a sharp, high-frequency crack that bounces off the stone walls. The echo travels faster than the tiger can react, alerting the hidden hunters perched on ledges above. Evidence from the Grotte des Gorges site in southern France shows where patterns on the bone shards consistent with repeated impact, and residue analysis reveals traces of carnivore saliva, confirming that big cats did indeed fall into these engineered pitfalls. The hunters themselves wore layers of furs sewn into snug, insulated cloaks, their heads protected by fur-lined caps that muffled the wind. They would lie low, breath barely visible in the frigid air, and use simple wooden spears tipped with flint. When the echo signaled the tiger's approach, they would unleash a coordinated barrage of spears and firebrands, the latter ignited from a portable ember kept in a bark-wrapped pouch, a technique known from sites such as Kostanki, where ash layers indicate repeated fire use. Scientists believe this acoustic strategy was a response to the acoustic shadow, effect observed in deep ravines. Sound waves can be focused and amplified, making even a faint footfall audible from a distance. By turning the environment into a natural alarm system, early humans turned their biggest predator into a predictable, trap-able target without needing armor or firearms. It's a reminder that ingenuity often springs from listening to the world around you, something our ancestors did exceptionally well. even when the temperature dropped to -40 degrees and a saber-toothed cat prowled the icy shadows. How did a 70-year-old woman keep a stash of dried reindeer meat from turning into a frozen mess when the temperature outside was a relentless -30 degrees? The answer lies not in magic, but in the very real, painstaking knowledge that elders accumulated over decades of living on the edge of the ice sheet. During the last glacial maximum, grandparents were the living libraries of the band, and their everyday chores turned into the glue that held the whole group together. First, they were the chief custodians of food stores. Archaeologists have found deep, insulated pits at sites such as Dolny Vestonis and Pavlov in the Czech lands that contain layers of charred mammoth hide, dried berries, and powdered plant roots, all carefully packed in animal skins and covered with a blanket of earth, moss, and snow. Radiocarbon dating shows that these pits were refilled and checked season after season, a pattern that matches ethnographic studies of Siberian reindeer herders, where elders oversee the winter pantry. The older the caretaker, the better the chance that the cache will survive the spring melt without rot or scavenger intrusion. Second, grandparents were the keepers of survival hacks that modern textbooks barely mention. They taught youngsters how to make a simple yet effective cold frame out of a hollowed-out log and a layer of transparent animal hide, creating a microclimate that could keep freshly smoked fish from freezing solid while still preserving it for weeks. In the high-altitude caves of the Altai, bone needles discovered alongside grinding stones bare were patterns consistent with the repair of clothing, an activity most often associated with the older women of the group, who knew which fibers could be blended to make a wind-proof, yet breathable, woven layer. When a member of the band suffered a laceration, it was the elders' hands that applied the first line of care. Cut marks on prehistoric femur fragments show evidence of plant-based poultices made from willow bark and crushed pine resin, ingredients that only someone who had spent a lifetime watching the seasons would know to harvest at the right moment. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that these mixtures have mild antiseptic properties, slowing infection long enough for the wound to close naturally. Grandparents also acted as the strategic watchdogs of the night. Their slower, more deliberate movements made less noise, and their deep knowledge of predator routes allowed them to set up low-tech alarms, crackling dry grass strings stretched across a cave entrance that would snap and alert the sleepers to a prowling cave lion. This practice is documented in the cave paintings of Chauvet, where a series of tiny handprints, likely made by the oldest members, frame the larger hunting scenes, hinting at a protective role. Finally, the presence of elders reinforced social cohesion. Studies of DNA from ancient burials reveal that older individuals were not merely left to die, they were buried with care, often alongside valuable tools. This suggests that the group invested in the well-being of its seniors because their memory of past climate swings, successful hunting routes, and safe shelter locations was priceless. In an environment where a single misstep could mean starvation, the ability to recall a hidden spring discovered 20 winters ago could be the difference between life and death. So, while the icy winds of the last glacial maximum seemed to favor the strong and the young, it was the quiet, steady hands of grandparents, guarding food stores, teaching cold frame tricks, tending wounds with plant medicines, and sounding the alarm against predators, that kept the community alive, generation after generation. How did our Ice Age ancestors keep their teeth from turning into a crumbling mess when a single broken molar could mean the difference between a successful hunt and a day of starving? The answer isn't a fancy toothbrush, because those didn't exist, but a suite of clever, low-tech strategies that archaeologists have pieced together from dental wear patterns, residue analysis, and the occasional lucky find of a preserved chewing stick. First, the very act of chewing the right kind of food acted as a natural abrasive. The diet of Upper Paleolithic hunters was heavy on raw meat, tendons, and tough hide, but it also included a surprising amount of fibrous plant matter, grasses, roots, and tubers. When they gnawed on raw bark or chew sticks made from willow, spruce, or birch, the rough fibers scraped plaque off the enamel, much like a primitive floss. Microscopic analysis of fossilized teeth from sites such as Lascaux and the Altai Mountains shows characteristic polish in the biting surface where these plant fibers made contact, indicating regular use of toothpicks to clear debris. Second, the mineral content of their water and diet provided a natural fluoride boost. Ice Age meltwater often ran over limestone or chalk, picking up calcium and fluoride ions. When these minerals were ingested, they were incorporated into the enamel, making it harder and more resistant to decay. Isotopic studies of tooth enamel from the Siberian Yana River Valley reveal elevated fluoride levels compared to modern averages, supporting the idea that the environment itself acted as a protective coating. Third, they practiced a sort of dietary timing. Evidence from dental microware suggests that after a big kill, they would consume the meat quickly, while the tougher connective tissues were saved for later, often after the sun had set. This staggered intake reduced the amount of sugary blood and marrow that would otherwise sit on the teeth for long periods, limiting the growth of acid-producing bacteria. In other words, they didn't leave a sticky, meat-laden buffet on their teeth overnight. When injuries did happen, say, a cracked tooth from biting into a frozen bone, pre-modern people had a simple first aid kit, a mix of softened clay or ash and animal fat. The paste could be pressed onto the wound to seal it and reduce bacterial infiltration. Some sites, like the Dolny Vestana settlement, have yielded tiny fragments of burnt limestone that researchers think were ground into a gritty powder and used as an early abrasive cleaning agent, akin to a primitive toothpaste. Finally, social habits played a role. Anthropologists have observed that many Ice Age groups lived in small, tight-knit bands where sharing food was the norm. When one member's teeth began to fail, the group would often allocate softer, pre-processed foods, like mashed tubers or boiled meat, to that individual, ensuring they could still eat without overloading fragile teeth. This communal dietary accommodation reduced the pressure on any single set of teeth and likely lowered overall rates of dental disease. All of these pieces, chewing sticks, mineral-rich water, staggered feeding, clay fat poultices, and communal feeding strategies, combine to paint a picture of a surprisingly sophisticated dental care system. It wasn't about sparkling smiles. It was about keeping the only tools they had, their jaws and teeth, functional enough to survive in a world where a single bite could be a matter of life or death. How could a whole tribe pack up, follow the same icy river each year, and still make it through a world where winter meant -40 degrees, bitter winds, and predators on the prowl? The answer lies in a pattern that archaeologists are only now piecing together. A winter migration that was less about chasing game and more about mastering the frozen landscape itself. When the last glacial maximum rolled in, the ice sheets forced the forest belt southward, leaving a narrow ribbon of open, snow-covered steppe along the permafrost-bound river valleys. These valleys acted like natural highways, their banks insulated by the water beneath, staying just a few degrees warmer than the surrounding tundra. Radiocarbon dates from hearths at sites such as the Danube's Upper Paleolithic camp at Bako, Cairo, and the Siberian Mammoth Steppe. Sites show repeated occupation layers exactly 12 to 15 years apart, precisely the length of a generational cycle. People used the river's frozen surface as a sturdy platform. They built low, insulated shelters, essentially thick skin-covered frames of spruce poles, plastered with reindeer hide and packed with moss and animal fat. The hides acted like a primitive down, trapping the warm air from a central fire pit. Because the river froze solid, they could dig shallow trenches directly into the ice, line them with furs, and crawl into them at night. The ice acted as a thermal mass, releasing stored heat slowly and keeping the interior from plunging below freezing. Food procurement was equally clever. While the river froze, fish such as sturgeon and whitefish were trapped under the ice, and hunters would cut narrow channels to dip spears through the thin ice, a technique confirmed by wear patterns on stone points from the sites. Meanwhile, the surrounding tundra teemed with migratory reindeer herds that followed the same frozen routes. Hunters set up communal drive lanes along the riverbank, funneling the animals into natural corrals formed by ice cliffs. The resulting kills supplied meat, hides, and bone tools for the entire group. Fire, the lifeline of any cold-weather people, was kept alive with a sophisticated firebank system. Small, insulated pits dug into the permafrost held embers wrapped in birch bark and pine resin. The permafrost kept the embers from being extinguished by wind, while the insulating bark prevented them from melting the surrounding ice. Each night, a member would stoke the ember bank, ensuring a ready flame for cooking and warmth without the daily labor of striking flint. The migration also offered a safety net against predators. The frozen river limited the movement of wolves and cave lions, who found it harder to chase prey across slick ice. Moreover, the tribe's camps were arranged in a semicircular pattern, with the fire pit at the center and a watch line of spearmen positioned along the ice edge, ready to repel any intruder. Elders played a vital role in this cycle. Their memory of the river's subtle bends, safe crossing points, and the timing of reindeer migrations was passed down orally, encoded in rhythmic chants that doubled as seasonal calendars. Without that knowledge, a misstep could mean a deadly exposure or a missed hunt. In short, the winter migration was a finely tuned, repeatable strategy. By locking onto the frozen river's predictable geometry, insulating their shelters with the river itself, storing fire in permafrost-protected banks, and timing their hunts to the reindeer's own migration, entire tribes could survive, thrive, and return to the same icy corridor year after year, proving that even in the harshest ice age, human ingenuity was the warmest blanket of all.